The lifeblood of a community is the stories that exist within it. It's kind of what has always drawn me to community news. When it boils down to it, I like to be the vessel in which the community stories are presented. And in general, it's just stories. That has always been a draw for me. When I was young and naive and fresh on my way out of high school, I overlooked the stories that exist in a small town. I thought I needed to be in the city to tell the best stories. I thought that's where everything was happening. And then, like most of us happens, life threw its curveballs and I ended up back in Dufferin County where I was born and raised. It was probably the best thing that could have happened to me, as eventually I ended up working for both local newspapers and have kind of been back and forth between the two of them over my years here. During that time, I quickly learned that community news is several different beasts at the same time. You have your typical news parts of it, you're telling your breaking news, your stories of what's going on, but there's also an element to it that I don't feel like really exists in the city, which is your community stories. There's stories that tug on people's hearts, that tell the tales of the people within the community, that connect each other, and that kind of work as a heartbeat of the community. They kind of create like a puzzle piece from the people who live there to create what is the greater whole of the community. And I realize I'm saying create a lot and repeating words, so I'm very sorry. That's not to say these kinds of stories don't exist in larger communities or in the city, but the chance that those stories will hit home as much are a lot slimmer. If you have, for example, a veteran sharing the story of their experience in the war, there's thousands of veterans with thousands of similar stories living in the city. So while they'll still have an impact and they'll still be powerful, they don't quite have the same pull as hearing that story from one of the fewer ones who will live in a smaller community like this, who likely has a personal connection with a number of the people in the community, who's known. So it makes it a really different type of impact when you tell those stories. Sorry. And I'm fairly certain a large part of my love for telling these stories and for identifying these stories comes from the fact that I grew up here. I spent the majority of my life here, so everything I know is part of Dufferin County. It's given me the opportunity through telling these stories to connect with people I never would have otherwise, and sometimes to learn more about the people I already knew. I've had the opportunity not just to form working relationships with people I've admired in the community over the years, but to in turn help them share their stories and their passions with the community. Every story that is told has the potential to be something great. While it might not be a story of greatness to everyone, there will always be someone whom it inspires or touches. It's how you craft it that makes all the difference. I've always described writing an article or story to people like putting together a puzzle. The way it works in my mind is every quote, every portion of the interview, every comment, every moment of their story is a puzzle piece, and I'm just trying to find the best way to fit it together so that it flows and tells the most powerful version of their story that it can. Which kind of comes to the difference between telling a news story and writing a personal human interest story. News involves research, facts, and information. You can create storytelling elements within it, especially if there's a human interest angle, but essentially it's about finding an interesting way to present often tedious, sometimes very boring information. Whereas the community stories are about people. They're about journeys, emotions, and the elements that pull on the heartstrings. This also makes the interview process very different than for a news story. It's less about garnering information and more about hearing the story. And the more you can get a person to share on their own without having to prompt from too many questions, the better a story you can tell. The interview is filled with raw emotions and thoughts as opposed to a standard question and answer format. My process in those interviews is very different than what I was taught in journalism school. We were always required to have all of our questions written out in advance and then formulate questions on the spot as needed. That's not a bad process, as it ensures you get everything that you need. It just never has been the way I've performed because it never seems to generate the parts of the story that you really want. People don't get as invested in sharing their story when everything is done as a just please answer this question and this question and this question. I tend to prefer the conversational format. A few key questions are always important to generate conversation, but it gives room for the interview to go where it needs to go, which very much resembles my own writing process, which a close friend of mine has always referred to as the fly by the seat of my pants process. I just kind of dive in and I see where it leads me. The biggest part why I prefer that process is it allows me to get a feel for the voice of the person I'm interviewing. I can take on a greater understanding not only of the way they speak, but of their thought process, of what the story means to them, and how their own thoughts and feelings flow into the story. That way, when I go to sit down and write the story, even though it's still my words and my voice as the narrator of the story, it's their language that's telling it. I'm guiding the story, but it's still their heart, their passion, their voice that is coming through as the most powerful part of the story. It's the one bit of praise I've received over the years that I've clung on to, because it's exactly why I got into journalism in the first place. To create a platform for people to have their voices elevated where they need to, deserve to, or simply have the opportunity to. When Shannon first reached out to me to speak tonight, she mentioned coming up with some of my favorite stories that I've written over the years as a part of my time as a journalist. And it was a much harder task than I expected. Throughout my time reporting in Orangeville, which I started in 2012, I've told hundreds of stories every year that I've worked at the papers. I've had stories that have brought me great joy to tell, stories that have taught me a lot, ones that have given me insane anxiety attacks, and ones that have impacted me personally, either because of my own connection to similar situations or the sheer depth and immensity and emotion of what it was that I was writing about. There were also a lot of stories that were a lot of fun to tell. Most of the stories I wrote for Motoring, which was a publication that ran in the Orangeville Citizen once a month, fell under the fun category. I got to travel around to different car shows. I got to interview people who had amazing classic cars and do a lot of stories on those. I don't know much about cars. I still, after years of working in automotive magazines, after working in the industry, I still can't tell you how to change your oil. I do, however, love cars. And so getting to cover those was actually a huge joy and lots of fun to take the pictures, which is where a few of my favorite stories actually came from. One of them was a gentleman who lived at the Lord Dufferin Center, and he had a classic Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. It used to sit at the front of the Lord Dufferin Center, and every now and again, I think residents would get rides in it, and he resided there for a few years. So I was asked to go and interview him about this, and we had a 3-hour-long conversation. He had started off working at a Rolls-Royce factory in England, where they started creating the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. And during the war, he was there where they switched to making parts for the different ships and everything, whatever it was that Rolls-Royce did. And eventually he made his way over to Canada with his family, where he started a body shop that was for classic British cars only. And it had always been his dream to own this Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. So eventually he owned it, and he got to drive around it, and it was a beautiful car. But it was really neat. It was 3 hours of just sitting there listening to this man tell me his life story that came from this favorite car of his, which was really, really incredible.
Tabitha, did he let you drive?
I love to drive. Did he?
Did
Yes.
he let you drive?
He did, yes.
Oh my gosh, he drove a silver. Wow.
Yeah, I don't remember what year it was. I want to say it was like a 1956 that he ended up getting, but it was a gorgeous car, and he would drive around, and he had a little picnic table in the back of it that would fold out, and he'd do picnics, and it was really cool. Another of my favorite stories also came from the Lord Dufferin Center, which actually was a hot spot of favorite stories when I worked at the Orangeville Citizen. And there was a resident there who, I think his name was Paul, and he was a World War II veteran and a survivor of a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And again, it was another 3-hour story that we had, talking with him about his life in the war, about everything he experienced, about what it was like when they had one of their squadron, I don't know if that's the right word, but their group betray them to the Japanese, and that was how they were captured, how they eventually escaped and were saved and got out of there. And it was just such an incredible story, because it's something I will hopefully never experience or understand or comprehend. For most of us, I think it's a very different lifetime that we will never have that ability to understand. And so just learning and seeing not only what he went through, but where he went in life afterwards. And again, from the Lord Dufferin Center, another story was a woman who stayed there several years ago was one of the British Home Children. If you're unaware of what the British Home Children were, they were orphans who were shipped to Canada, I think possibly the US as well, to help work the farms and the fields during the World War, which was essentially a way so that they had less mouths to feed in England. They were shipping them off. A lot of them ended up, they weren't servants, they were slaves. They were treated horribly, they were beaten, they were abused, often ripped away from family and siblings. And it was a really horrible story, but this woman was a survivor of being a British home child. And so I had the opportunity again to sit down for several hours and listen to her life. And it was very incredible to hear where she came from and where she ended up. She ended up with a beautiful family, settled down here, and her life had just completely changed from where it could have been. She was one of the few fortunate ones. And I think with stories like those, part of why they're a favorite to me is that it's often less about the story that I'm writing and more about the opportunity for those people to share the stories. Sometimes it's just that they need to share the story. Sometimes it's that people need to hear those stories to have a greater understanding of our own history. But they're all simply just the opportunity to hear the story was the biggest and most powerful part. Sorry, I lost my spot. Yeah, and I think the biggest part too is that these are things I'm only vaguely familiar with. And when you're telling these stories, it's also important for people to know our history, not just because they need to be aware of our history, but without knowing them, we can't make the changes we need to make in order to be better, because there is still a lot we have to do for a lot of elements that we aren't aware existed as a problem in the first place. I know the word resilience has often been overused during this pandemic, but it is honestly one of the biggest reasons my favorite stories are my favorites. The people that I've interviewed have demonstrated the resilience in the face of some of the darkest, most horrifying situations, often leading to beautiful and inspiring stories coming out of it. And that's not to say I believe all stories do, can, or should have an inspiring tale. Many don't, and no one should ever feel their trauma needs to become inspiring or demonstrate immense resiliency. But what I love about these stories is that they do a bit to restore hope and humanity, because they didn't need to turn around and offer hope, love, or inspiration. It is something that they did without any being forced to do it. Sorry. Which kind of leads into probably the most powerful story for me personally that I've written and my number one favorite. For a long time, Metroland hosted a series called Behind the Crimes, where we would find crimes, hopefully that were local, and try to look at what has happened since then, what impact the crimes had on the community, and the lives of the people that were involved. It was my turn last fall, and it took a while to find the story that I wanted to do, because there's so much complication in trying to come up with these stories. There are so many factors to consider, such as if you're addressing murders or violent crimes, the immediate family has to be made aware that you're running the story, which in and of itself can be very difficult to do. How do you reach out to a family who dealt with so much and be like, hey, I know this was your trauma, but we're putting it on the front page? So there's so much caution that has to be involved. There has to be acknowledgement that the family might not be comfortable with it, and it might not be a story you can pursue because of that. Then there's the whole part of whether or not the family is even willing to be interviewed for the story. It's a lot to ask anyone to relive one of the worst points of their lives, and it's such a delicate situation to navigate. I had managed to narrow mine down to two stories: a group of farmers who were arsonists from Melanchthon in the 1860s, which I still hope to do a piece on, and the story of the Babineaus. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Babineaus story involved two of the family's children being killed by a friend at their school one night in 1984. The former would have been more lighthearted and less heavy, a look at an interesting, not very well-known chapter in our county's history. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, getting historical resources, getting sources and records for the story was exceedingly difficult. So that factor in itself made the story for me. And I hemmed and hawed about whether or not I could even bring myself to proceed with the Babineau story in the first place. There were a lot of interesting elements that drew me to telling the story, such as the ties in the trial to what's been fondly named the Satanic Panic surrounding the tabletop RPG game Dungeons & Dragons, or what eventually led to discovering the teen who committed the act. It was also the landmark case under the newly created Young Offenders Act, and the teen was the first person ever to be tried under that act. That was a whole other ballgame in and of itself, as it was never imagined that the Young Offenders Act would be used in a case for murder. So reaching out to the father, Marcel Babineau, was one of the most anxiety-inducing things I have ever done. I had no idea what to expect when I picked up the phone and called him, and if I'm being completely honest, I expected to get yelled at, possibly sworn at, and hung up on. But after hanging up with him, I sat in shock at my desk, because not only was he one of the kindest people I had ever spoken to, he was also completely willing to sit down and chat about one of the darkest moments of their lives after I explained what the story focus was going to be on. And in speaking with him on the phone, I learned I had actually interviewed him once before, while I worked at the Citizen for Project Angel, which was the fundraiser he had set up for the statues in the graveyard in his children's honor, back when it was launched in 2014. But at the time, I didn't know the connection nor what the significance was of the children. So next I had to consider who else I would even interview. An acquaintance of mine had actually managed to track down the teen who committed the murder. Due to the Young Offenders Act, his name had been withheld and never published. But it's a small town and it doesn't take much digging to find out names, especially when everybody knows everybody kind of thing. And it was named in forums and Facebook groups reminiscing over it. We had his new name, his location, and probably could have easily found a phone number to reach out to him. But just because you found them doesn't necessarily mean they deserve the opportunity to speak about it or to share their thoughts on what happened and what their life has been like since. So despite my friend's incredible sleuthing, I decided to leave it to two voices, Marcel and the police chief who had worked the case. Marcel and I sat for about 45 minutes outside of Mokaberry the day of our interview. I had already interviewed the police chief for everything that had happened in 1984 and pulled up the research around the case itself. So our conversation was more about everything the experience that it had been for Marcel and his wife and what happened after that horrifying night. As a relatively new mom, hearing the story was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Child death on its own is terrible, as I'm sure many can relate. But as a new mom, it weighs even heavier trying to even fathom or comprehend it. A big part of my job is pushing beyond myself because it's not about me, so I did push beyond myself, and I'm glad I did. Marcel was hands down one of the most inspiring people I have ever had the honor of interviewing, largely because he and his wife and their two surviving children had every right to be bitter and angry to see the world as a vile place. They had every reasonable excuse accessible to them to never move on from that tragedy. But it wasn't an issue for them. Marcel eventually took his experience as an opportunity to help others grieving the loss of their own children, no matter what the cause was that led to the death. He poured back into the community. Despite every single reason he could have told the world to screw off, he chose to continue looking forward and finding ways to bring other people hope and solace. These are the kind of stories I think the community needs to hear, especially in a small community like ours. Not because we need the details or a behind-the-curtains look, but because it both gives us an example of the kind of human beings we should all strive to be and helps us develop a greater understanding of the passion behind the people who give back to the community time and time again. That is about all I've got at this time. So I want to say thank you to everyone who came to listen to me or to support me tonight. And thank you to the Orangeville Library for inviting me to speak. It's difficult to express just how much of an honor it is for me to be standing up here speaking, not just to be asked to be a speaker in the first place, but in particular to be at this library. This is the place that I fell in love with reading as a child and storytelling. It can be directly attributed to being a major player in what fostered my love of writing and my passion around stories and community. I can't think of a more incredible place to have had the opportunity to do this for my first time speaking. I don't feel like it.
No, storytelling is your gift, and so it just comes right through.
Thank you.
And just before we get into questions, I will share about myself, the Babineau family. They really are as beautiful as you conveyed. And when our family experienced a very public loss, they reached out to us right away and were huge supports for us. And so just how inspiring I think these community stories are, and it must. I know if it was me, I would look back to these stories often, and when you're going through a downspout or something, and just say, look at what these people have gone through, and look at what they've done.
Absolutely.
And how inspiring it must be to get to hear those stories. And it's such a privilege for people to share those stories with you.
Yeah.
Questions or comments?
Yeah, actually, I think, judging as far as where journalism is at this point in time, I do find that you're as, you know, when you are looking at chasing a story or developing a story, that there is any of that. I'm trying to think of a better word of poisonous behavior against journalism, but do you ever find that seems to be growing a bit more, or are people still, or the majority of people still very open and?
I would say it is growing a lot more. Especially even, so I took a 4-year hiatus from reporting after I left the Orangeville Citizen and starting at the Banner. And even in that 4 years, I would say there's been a huge shift in the way I've personally seen it. I think other reporters have shared similar sentiments. And I really do think it's largely that the mainstream media has done a very poor job at making themselves trustworthy. And that's not to say every journalist at every mainstream media, but there's been this overarching kind of move back towards the whole "it bleeds, it leads" thing, which was always the running joke in journalism school, because that's what people want to grab. So you have the clickbaity articles, you have the things that incite drama, because that's what people react to. And for a while, I think kind of journalism was shifting away and was shifting more towards being there just to tell the news, which is what we're supposed to be able to do and tell those stories. And as that attitude has kind of come back, people seem to be less trustworthy of the news in general. And I do find in the small town as well, if it's a lot harder to recover the reputation if someone hasn't been happy with the way something has been reported. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the reporting was done wrong. Sometimes it is the case of the reporters, because we are human, we're flawed. But it's just if someone feels negatively about the way it's come out, it does a lot of damage in the ability for them to trust the media. So it's definitely something that I would say has been showing up a little bit more than it used to.
That is kind of a shame. I was kind of hoping that from a smaller community perspective would be somewhat immune to that, but...
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure it happens less than it does at the larger publications, but there are a lot of times where it does happen. And even stories where the story could have been very different if the people who were involved in it would have been willing to speak or willing to be truthful about what was going on in the first place. So it's a little bit frustrating seeing that trend, and I do hope it's something that we can maybe gain back that trust that we've lost.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was wondering, Tabitha, thank you, first of all. I was wondering, how do you remain neutral as a journalist when you come into situations where, you know, people want your opinion? What do you think? And, you know, do you agree or disagree? You know, talking about that COVID-19 or masks, no masks, or Black Lives Matter, or how do you navigate yourself in those situations?
It took a long time to figure out how to do it, because it is difficult. What am I trying to say? You can't be a reporter if you don't have an opinion. You can't be a reporter if you're not biased. That was one of the big things that they drove home in us when we were in journalism school. But again, like you said, it's about how do we then remove ourselves from that. And it's a really difficult process to describe, but the best thing I can say is that it's about emotionally removing myself from the situation. I essentially, as I go to work on a story, I have to leave myself at the door and look at the facts, look at the reporting, look at what needs to be written, and put it together as if I had no opinion on the matter, which can be a very, very difficult thing to do, particularly in cases that have a lot to do with the community themselves, because as a resident of the community and as a taxpayer of the community, I do have quite a few opinions, and there are a lot of things that do affect me directly. So I find it's a lot harder being a reporter in the community I live in because of that. One example would be the Michelle Hansen trial, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. I have a lot of personal feelings on that one I can't share because we don't want to be influencing people's opinions either way, but also because I can't have my reporting in any way reflect how I'm feeling about the trial itself. It has to be 100% this is what's happening. So it has to be basically, it's a trained thing of turning off your emotions and basically becoming as disconnected from the story as you can be. And unfortunately, sometimes there are times where it's not possible. And at that point, you usually have to decide if it's a story you can continue sharing or if there's a way that you can share it without letting your own emotional issues get involved in it, which I know isn't really a clear answer, but it's a very difficult way to move forward with it.
Do you get to decide what your stories are, Tabitha, or do you get assigned certain stories sometimes, and can you, like, do you have a choice to say, no, I can't do that?
It's a mix.
Okay.
We do find a lot of our own stories. Each reporter does try and find their own, but obviously because I'm sure even the library knows, like, news releases come out, so sometimes we'll get assigned, sometimes stories come to us. Sometimes there's specific things that are done, especially when we do series at Metroland, everyone kind of has to take a turn doing things. So it's kind of a mix of them, but for the most part, we do find our own stories, or we pick which ones we want to take.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And quickly, my other question was, libraries, for years we've been told that we're a dying thing because of, everything's online, everything's digital. And as people that work in a library, we find that's not the case. We're not a dying thing. We're more than just books, and we're definitely more than just e-books. Of course, e-book usage has grown tremendously, but we're lots of other things. I know that similar things have been said about journalism and the print media and that sort of thing. What does that look like here in Dufferin County? Does that have a big impact? Is it less of an impact here? Are there more newspapers, that sort of thing?
Personally, I think it's less of an impact, and I don't know whether it's that we have a much larger older population, and by older I don't mean elderly, but from the ages where online news wasn't a normal thing, that a lot of people still prefer to have the physical newspaper. So I don't see, at least in our area, that being an issue. I have witnessed it in other areas where I've seen papers shut down because nobody wanted in-person physical newspapers anymore. I just don't see that happening. Social media absolutely is a big thing, and online traffic is big, but people like their in-person newspapers. A lot of people do.
Yeah, I was wondering about social media and that dynamic. I mean, in one way, you must find stories through social media, right? Because people are constantly sharing things, or especially those local Q&A groups. I think a lot of content comes out of that. But then at the same time, stories can also get watered down or can be twisted and turned in that same platform. And just, I don't know if you can speak to that and how you balance that social media.
Yes, social media is an interesting monster, I'll call it. Like you said, we do find a lot of great stories in there. The Q&A can sometimes be a fountain for incredible stories. And I think it does, in many ways, give us a pulse on the communities we don't necessarily have otherwise, because we see some of the stories that would get shared that people don't just run around town yelling, hey, this is what's happened recently. But like you said, things can get watered down, things can get twisted. I find the biggest thing is that people don't actually read online. So people will respond to the headline or the comment that goes above the story, and stories will be shared, things will be said about the story, all based off those two elements that aren't within the story. And personally, I think on our side, that means that there has to be greater responsibility maybe to crafting headlines a certain way, to crafting the comments a certain way. But again, you get into the nature of the beast of social media, where as much as people complain about clickbait and dramatic titles, people will read those quite a bit more than they will read the ones that are not. So it's a very difficult thing to figure out how to navigate, and I think most journalists and news outlets are still trying to figure out how to navigate it. How do you balance doing the job you need to while also acknowledging that you need that social media interaction, you need that social media traffic to survive? So it's complicated is the easiest answer I can give.
I think it was CBC articles I've noticed on social media, they have the comment section closed. I think it's CBC. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
As some sort of pilot study that they're doing?
They are, and I think that's becoming more common. I know at the Banner, we turned off comments on our website about, I think, going on a year ago now. And other news outlets are doing it on Facebook and stuff. I think it's necessary. I think a lot of times the story gets lost within the comments, within people's opinions. People will read the comments instead of reading the article, or they'll, like you said, people will sometimes twist what's said in the article, and the people reading it will read the comment. No, it actually happens in the article. And it's a hard thing, because I think it's good to have that discussion platform there, but at what point is the discussion platform causing more problems. And there's nothing that prevents the articles from being shared by people online, from sharing from the Facebook page and adding their comments there. It's just kind of that whole, where do you draw the line? Most of the time it's not bad. I'm sure you've all seen the Orangeville Banner page can get quite volatile at times on there. And I really don't know where Metroland is at from that. Personally, I think I'd like to see it tested on certain types of articles because I do feel the stories and the importance of things happening get lost. I don't know that I would ever be okay with it being completely shut off just because, again, it takes away that element of discussion. And especially as more papers are moving towards not being able to have space for letter to the editor sections, it becomes more important to be able to have those forums for people to submit their responses because not everyone also knows that they can email. So having that access there, I think, is important in some ways.
I think though with comments, isn't it kind of, again, it's not being in journalism, right? But I always thought that that's a real slippery slope because the provision of comments almost suggests that it should be a call for action. And, in a lot of cases, there's nothing that you can respond to, but it's that left dangling that taints the entire story.
Yeah. And again, that's where the complication does come in. And it's honestly so much more complicated than it was when I got into journalism. And I realize I'm still fairly young as far as that goes. But, when I got into journalism, Facebook just came out my second year of journalism school. Twitter came out the year I graduated. It wasn't really, online wasn't really a thing, like newspapers had websites, but I can even remember our college website was really kind of odd and awkward to navigate because people weren't reading online. We didn't get as much training in how to do stuff because it just didn't exist. So I think it's difficult for a lot of us, not just as the reporters, but people in general, to figure out how to navigate those things and how, whether or not it's a good thing to have and where to draw the line because it's new to all of us.
Actually, it brings up a question. Do you have to write differently for an online article than for a print article?
Some do, we don't. Our articles, what we write and goes online goes in print if it's going to be printed. Now there's more of a trend where because physical papers do have less space now, more articles won't make it in the paper. But that's part of why everything is kind of written the same way because we never know what's going to go in. There are times, like if we have a story that needs to have a longer version, typically the longer version will end up online and then a condensed version could end up in the paper. But in general, for our paper at least.
I know that the Banner is affiliated with Metroland. Do you think that has an impact on the local stories and that sort of thing, or does it help having that support in the background for our local paper?
I think it helps. They don't have a huge influence over what happens as far as what stories we're telling. More so it's like, well, when we have Metroland-wide series where all of the Metroland papers will be focusing on certain issues. So like last year we had one that was on racism that we were trying to tackle and diversity. We had a series that was called, what was it? I don't remember the name of it, but basically it was addressing drug trafficking and human trafficking through the communities and stuff. So we did a series on that. So those ones are guided, but they're more rare. Otherwise, I do find it's really helpful to have one because you have access to more resources. And there's a greater standard of how things are done. So it can't change from paper to paper as far as what the reporting standards are, what the codes of conduct are, what kind of language is acceptable. It's set out by them and it filters down to us. So it does help in that way that you're not looking at every paper within the community having different standards for how they report. So I do find that's helpful.
I just wondered, Tabitha, what would be a typical day for you at the Orangeville Banner? Do you have a team of, do you have a photographer or a sound person or security people? How does it work in the day?
Well, we don't work out of the office right now because of the pandemic. I actually have not had the opportunity to work in the Banner office during my time full-time there, just because I started during the pandemic. But we don't have separate photographers. We have myself, and two other journalists, right now. We all work from home, and we are the photographer, we are our own security, we are everything. So it's hard to say a typical day because days can be so different as a journalist. I can have days where I'm literally sitting there refreshing my email, trying to find something desperately because by some magic fluke, there's been nothing going on. I have other days where, it's just a matter of emailing and interviews, and other days where I'm literally running ragged, trying to get from events to interviews to taking photos to covering breaking news. But we also we do work as a collective. So especially breaking news, when certain breaking news things happens where a reporter needs to be on the ground, one of the great parts of social media and internet is that we can send one of us out to go get photos and try and talk to people on site while another person calls, OPP, fire, starts writing up the information so we can get everything online much quicker. That's how that would function in those things, which has been a huge help and very nice to have that kind of teamwork that can happen.
So because with your writing, you have to remain neutral, and you were saying it's a tough balance between keeping your emotion out, but then as a writer also having your voice, and that consistent voice of being heard throughout your writing. So do you have another sort of writing outlet? Do you write other things on the side so that you can just be free to have that emotion and to develop your own voice outside of reporting?
I used to, yes. I haven't, just because life as a mom and COVID pandemic and everything else. But yeah, blogging was a huge thing for me for years, which I'm trying to get back into now. Just gives me that opportunity. That was a big one. I also write fiction on the side, so I've been working on a novel for a few years. And I find that helps, and it is necessary. And I notice a huge difference in my personal mindset between when I'm taking the time to have those additional outlets and when I haven't been. Not necessarily, it doesn't impact my reporting in any way, but my mental state definitely gets impacted. Anxiety is higher when I'm reporting and I haven't had time to have those outlets. So yeah, I do have things on the side that I have to do to help keep me going on that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me and for coming out tonight.